My name is Sharon Ashworth. I'm the Horticulture and Natural Resources Agent. I will be on the host computer monitoring the chat. So if anybody on Zoom has a question for our speaker, we will save them for the end. I will monitor the chat and keep those going, and we'll ask those questions at the end. And if you would please keep your mics muted throughout the presentation. We will try to open it up at the end of the meeting and see what happens. But for now, Emily, could you please introduce our speaker?
Sure thing. Thank you, Sharon. So I was just putting this into the chat, but I will say this out loud for those on Zoom as well. I will be monitoring the videos for the class today. So if you're not sure how chat works or anything like that, and you have a question, please put your hand up and I will make sure to come back to you at the end and can help you out with that. So I'm Emily Lyson. I am the Vice President of the Master Gardeners, and I'm happy to introduce Leslie Wren. She's a licensed landscape architect and horticulturist, and she has practiced for more than 10 years in North Carolina and Texas, including managing her own solo practitioner firm before joining the faculty at K-State in 2019. Her professional experience is primarily in residential design, build, and maintain, but also includes public, institutional, commercial, and greenway projects. Wren's love of hands-on work has also led to stints as a farm laborer, a landscape foreman, and a leader of the volunteer installation of a school garden. Wren has a bachelor's degree in biology with a concentration in ecology and evolutionary biology from Rice University, and a master's degree in both horticultural science and landscape architecture from North Carolina State University. She is also a certified designer of early childhood environments through the Natural Learning Initiative. To Wren, her work as a landscape architect is as much a vocation as it is a job. There is no place better suited for experiencing deep humanity than the landscape. Landscape feeds our animal natures, spiritual connections, personal meanings, individual creativity, and community life. Working with people to make richer landscapes is sacred. It transforms lives. And now I will let Leslie take it away.
Hi, thank you for that introduction. Can you hear me okay? Emily, if you can give me the thumbs up, perfect. Okay, first off, I want to say thank you for joining me on this beautiful, cool, partly cloudy Saturday morning when probably everybody is really wishing they were out weeding right now and taking advantage of the beautiful weather that we're having for garden work. But I hope that you get a lot out of this presentation. I want to just check something real quick on my screen, Emily. I don't know if is it in speaker mode where y'all are able to see me as well as my shared screen? I'm going to speak a little bit more just to see if, okay, Sharon, thank you for the thumbs up. All right. Great. Well, I'm going to get started. Last year, I gave a presentation about designing spaces for people as we were in the middle of the pandemic. And this year I'm coming back to talk a little bit more about how the sausage gets made in non-pandemic times, or I guess even during pandemic times, how landscape architects, specifically those who work in residential design, think about designing outdoor spaces for folks' homes. Of course, a lot of these practices are used whether, when we're designing commercial or institutional landscape spaces too, but this is really geared towards a residential setting. So I will also say, I'm a professor. I welcome questions and discussion about things. So if there is a burning question that comes up in the chat during this talk, please feel free to interrupt me. You're not going to throw me off my game. This is how, this is my daily job. This is how it works. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. Okay, spoiler alert. If you were coming here thinking that this presentation was going to give you the ability to make an outdoor space happen like you might see on an HGTV show or something like that, sorry, you're going to be disappointed. The process of designing outdoor spaces just takes a lot of thought and iteration and revision. It's not something that somebody just walks onto a property blind and then is like, this is what should happen. No, like it's much more of an analysis process than what is shown on TV. But of course, like, because what we do, if it was actually shown on TV, it definitely would not sell ads. So, but hopefully this presentation will give you the starting point so that you can also engage in this process, even if you're not going to be on a TV show. Okay, so overview. At the very beginning, I'm going to tell you the materials you need to engage in an outdoor landscape design process. It's really not that big of a deal, but there are some specifics that will help your job. And then also I want to talk to you about the considerations that landscape architects think about in the process that we go through when we are designing a space. So not a lot of materials needed, doesn't cost a lot of money. You need pen or pencil and paper to take notes. Measuring tapes are your best friend. You know, whether it's a 16-foot measuring tape or a 100-foot measuring tape, or you have multiple measuring tapes because they're just most useful, you'll need a measuring tape. Probably the most important thing that I use besides a measuring tape is panoramic photos. And then also sometimes I use plan view drawings if I'm doing a residential space. It's not absolutely necessary, but they sometimes help too. But let me, oops, that is not what I meant to do. All right, let me tell you a little bit more about panoramic photos though, and why they're so important. It's really easy to, you know, get locked into a plan view, an overhead view of a landscape when you're designing it, but none of us experience a landscape from overhead. So working in perspective, working in, you know, thinking about the space as a human being experiences it is the best way to get a design that's going to be successful for a human being that's going to live in it. And panoramic photos are fantastic for this. You know, you want to think about taking these photos in the sequence in which one experiences a space. So maybe, you know, thinking about how you see it as you're approaching it, the entry point, moving through it, any thresholds, any place where you might change direction, how you might exit. And then if you make a return trip, many of our spaces, we actually go back through in the reverse direction. So making sure that you're thinking about it, you know, going and coming or coming and going is important. One other thing that is important is taking photos from points of stasis where somebody might be sitting, having a cup of coffee, having breakfast, having a happy hour beverage, whatever, but actually putting your body in the position where you would be, have that point of view of somebody who's sitting. So here's a photo of a client's house that I'm going to refer to through this presentation. They wanted to update their front yard. And so they wanted it to have more of a front porch feel, but also include some spots for perennial plants and growing leafy greens and herbs. And you know, this particular client also is aware of some feng shui design principles and wanted to close the square of their house's footprint in this L-shaped house. So here are two panoramic photos, one kind of looking at the house as you come in the driveway from the street, and then the other looking back at the street in a place that kind of felt like it was comfy for sitting. So here's that, you know, panoramic coming and going. Plan view. If you have a survey, it's helpful. But you don't necessarily need a survey. You know, you can pull an image from Google Maps and you can simplify that for your purposes. So again, you know, here's that view of this client's house, both the Google Map view and then just a simplified schematic. And again, this is the view from above. And we use this to help us map out the horizontal dimensions of landscape elements and also their relationships one to another. Okay, so now I'm getting into the process of how one goes about designing a landscape space. So we always begin with an inventory, and this is just documenting what's there, what the dimensions of things are, if they're in good condition, where they're located. This is just an objective view of what we have on site. Once we do that inventory, then we do an analysis. An analysis has two components to it. We are making judgments about what's good or bad about keeping existing elements that we've identified in the inventory. And then we're also making recommendations, whether those elements should be kept, altered, repurposed, etc. So, a lot of times people conflate these two steps, the inventory and the analysis, but they are actually separate. One is very objective and the other is subjective. And that analysis is always done with both the desires of the client for the space that they want, but also thinking about other good things, like minimizing flooding, maximizing rain infiltration, thinking about reducing perhaps energy costs for heating and cooling a house, minimizing the amount of work that one has to do in a landscape, those kinds of things. Okay, so again, I'm kind of going back to this client's house. And here's I've taken that panoramic photo of the entry, and I've, abstracted it, reduced it to basic forms with a line drawing. And so when I'm thinking about documenting those existing elements, I'm looking for the things that are like hard or in place or have to do with buried utilities or drainage. Oops, dang it, I did it again. Okay. So, here's that perspective, and I'm documenting, what are the important things that I would need to think about in this particular situation. Where's my garage? There's a downspout on one part of the house. I've got some existing trees that are in good condition. There's a lamp post in the middle of the lawn. This is just helping me, remember what is important in this particular space. But then, and this is where it starts to get messy. So, this is where your drawings are communicating things to yourself. But as a space designer, you have to think about how people move through spaces, how they look into them, what are the adjacencies, what are these other things that are going on around what you're designing. And so this is where I identify things like doors and windows. What are the rooms that are on the other sides of those doors and windows? What are the paths that the client might take moving into and out of that outdoor space? And what are the view sheds or the things that one would see at the different points in that space? Okay, so here is where I have to take a right turn into safety zone. I'm a licensed landscape architect, so I am obligated to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public in my work. And this is something that I take very seriously because certainly outdoor spaces have all sorts of possibilities in which somebody could get injured or worse. And so, things that I am thinking about from the very beginning of looking at a space are things that would potentially cause harm. So, probably top three things, definitely top three things are water features, drop-offs, and these could include like a steep slope or, like a retaining wall or a deck structure, or someplace where somebody could fall off of an upper level, a significant distance. And then I'm also thinking about identifying if there's any existing toxic or thorny plants on site. So, for water features, biggest things that we have to make sure we are protecting are sight lines, the ability to see that water feature, and then access, the ability to access it. So in this particular photo, and this is something I just pulled off the internet. It looks like we are looking at this pool from up above, which is great, but unless you're Spider-Man, you're not going to be like jumping off of this, second level porch down if you need to rescue a kid. So I would definitely want to be looking from inside the house and seeing, do I have a clear view? But just looking at this picture already, it appears that, those chaise lounges are providing a little bit of an access concern. It seems like one could move, perhaps around here to get into the pool if one needed. But, if ever I'm on a client's property and they have a pool or a fountain or a pond, I'm definitely thinking about preserving good sight and access or improving blocked views or blocked access. So things like drop-offs, fall risks are also something that I'm always looking for to maintain or improve. And so if you have, International Building Code specifies that if you have a drop-off of 30 inches or more, you need a railing. But certainly a drop-off of 24 inches could be significant for some people. So just keeping in mind like who your client is or who's going to be visiting this property, and thinking about, does there need to be some sort of barrier or railing where there's a drop-off? And it could be like a physical railing, or it could even be like a shrub planting, a hedge that might grow up above that level, and visually discourage moving beyond that, or even break a fall should somebody fall off of it. I'm also always thinking forward, that the space that I'm designing is not for me walking around the site doing the inventory and analysis. It is for people who will be using it. So I have to think about things like, will you have grandkids running around, chasing each other? Could there be an opportunity for a fall? Is there an opportunity where somebody might be carrying a platter of raw steaks to a grill, and they're thinking about carrying that platter and their view is partially blocked and they might miss the edge of a patio and take a tumble? Is there shrubs that are intended to be formally maintained on a slope that would cause an issue with somebody? Forgive my rooster. Somebody who is, wielding a pruning tool, that would be dangerous to be on that slope or even an upper level. So those are things that I'm thinking through too. And then, of course, thorny and toxic plants, use, if a child were to ingest a yew axle and crush that seed in their teeth, that would be extremely dangerous. They'd probably be going to the hospital, if not worse. And so, just identifying the really significantly dangerous plants, Japanese yew, castor bean, if I was down south, oleander, sago palm, the real baddies. And, are there children? Are there adults who have dementia? Are there pets that are on site that could be a danger for? And then similarly, like thinking about, is there a conflict with how somebody might want to use the space or need to maintain it? You don't want to plant something thorny or maintain something thorny around your hose reel, or if you have irrigation controller, because you are going to get stuck. And I don't want anybody to get a puncture in the spaces I design. I'm really sorry about that rooster. He just decided to take up residence out this window. So I guess you get a rooster song with this presentation. Okay, moving on from safety. Thinking about traffic, how your client, your users are going to be moving through the spaces you design is so, so, so important. I'm sure you all have heard form follows function, but I would even take a step back from that and say form follows traffic, function follows form follows traffic. I'm going to say that. how people are moving through the spaces that they're living in is really a huge consideration. And specifically, we're thinking about moving between spaces. If there's a grade change, a level change that somebody would have to navigate, and then navigating different surfaces, say moving from a concrete to a gravel area or a wood deck to stone patio. Those are things that we have to think about. So back to the client, thinking about just that front area where they want their garden, I'm starting to map where the primary traffic paths are. And, I'm even using different line weights to connote the hierarchy, the frequency that paths are used, how fast the clients are using them, how many people at a time might be using them. So I'm thinking about, travel from the house to or front door to the driveway, and then maybe you're walking in from the street to the front door, or you're going from the front door to the garage, or maybe even to the backyard. So respecting and recognizing those paths of travel first before I'm thinking about altering or placing anything in the landscape. Okay, so this also, makes me think about how are we going to handle it when there is a grade change, when you have to move from one level to another. And certainly in this part of the country, grade change is pretty much a de facto issue that we have to deal with. And so, thinking about where there have to be stairs, and, to drill down even further, there are standard riser heights, the level that a stair goes up, and then tread depths where your foot goes on the stair, that are used in design. And a lot of it is ultimately dictated by dimensional lumber. But just thinking about, if somebody needs to be moving fast, or somebody is moving slow, how the dimensions of those stairs can be modified to facilitate that movement. If a ramp needs to be incorporated, I'm also thinking about, how can I place it in a way where the experience of moving up the ramp is a positive one, doesn't feel like just an add-on, because perhaps somebody has mobility issues. That a person's experience moving through a space I design should be positive however they move through it. And then I also am always thinking about providing sufficient landing area, when you are going down or going up or coming across a threshold, going through a door. People are not comfortable coming out of a door and immediately having to step down, or, coming to the bottom of the stairs and immediately being in the middle of a traffic area. So providing that landing space, that space where one could cross the threshold of a door, adjust themselves to the new space, and then navigate a set of stairs or a ramp. Or come to the bottom of a stairs, pause their forward motion at a landing before they might have to enter a primary traffic route. So I'm thinking about those things that facilitate comfortable, safe navigation of grade change. And then lastly, I think about surfaces. So, on the spectrum from like poured concrete, very smooth, to pea gravel, shifty and movie, there's a variety of experiences that people have having to navigate a surface. And so I'm thinking about the solidity of the surface. If that's, if it's a high traffic, high speed traffic way, it needs to be more solid than not. Same with evenness. If it's high speed, high traffic, it needs to be an even surface. Now, the opposite can be true. If it's a slower path or a secondary or tertiary path, you can incorporate materials like limestone slabs, where you might have a little bit of variability in that surface, some texture for navigating. But just matching that surface with how it is crossed is really important. I also think about linearity. You know, if somebody is needing to move fast, you don't want to have a path that has a lot of curves or turns in it. Alternately, if you want somebody to take the scenic route, introducing some curve or some break in that line is a wonderful way to choreograph that experience for a user. Okay, now here's my soapbox issue for probably the whole talk. Well, one of them. Something that is so often missed in designing outdoor spaces is understanding and designing for the stride length of the user. I'm going to point down to this image down here, this very modern looking house with the 2 foot by 4 foot poured concrete slabs set in, looks like artificial turf here, artificial turf joints. Visually, this is very appealing, but subconsciously it creates friction in the minds of people who are moving through that space, because subconsciously they want to step on the solid pad. They don't want to step on the joint. But the arrangement of those pads is such that if they wanted to put their foot in the middle of those pads, they're going to be doing an unnatural walk, of almost like, walking on lily pads across a pond, or, step stones across a pond, rather than not having to look at the ground plane and just move to where they want to go. This image over here on the right with the flagstone, the rectangular flagstone pieces set in the river rock. The river pebble is a less stable surface, but it looks like even with this nonlinear path that the designer has created a way where somebody could walk across this with their natural stride and hit that solid flagstone surface all the way to this, location here with the chaise lounge. I wish I could tell you that there is a magic formula in a book somewhere about how to match stride. But one of the best ways to do it is just to do it in the field. And you can do this by setting a measuring tape out on the ground and walking it yourself, or having your client walk it. And particularly if you're working for clients who maybe there's a couple and one of them is taller than the other, having them both walk it to figure out where you can put those hard surfaces so that they'll be able to walk it without having to watch the ground the whole time. And this is, really next level design practice so that, the experience of being in that landscape is very smooth. And then lastly, because, safety, I'm also always looking for slip and trip hazards, making sure that if there is a grade change, it's preferable if it's at least 4 inches, that you don't have anything that's like a 2-inch extrusion off of the ground plane that could cause somebody to trip. Or also being very mindful of not using super smooth paving materials in locations that are shady and moist and could grow algae. Because that's a concern too, that if you're growing slime or algae on your walking surface and it's a smooth surface to begin with, it'd be very easy to hit it. It's like, summertime black ice. You just hit it and go down. Okay, moving on from traffic, I have mapped out how my users, my clients are moving through spaces. Now it's time to start thinking about actually creating those spaces in the voids that are in between the traffic areas. And so when I'm doing this in a residential situation, I'm thinking about it in 3 different ways. I'm thinking about how am I going to define that space? I'm thinking about what kind of experience I'm creating there. What are the sensory inputs that my client will experience there? And then I'm thinking about building in flexibility so that those spaces can breathe and accommodate the natural dynamism that is just part of life. So I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean with these 3 things. Okay, So when I'm talking about defining spaces, I'm talking about making very clear definitions of the ground plane, of vertical planes or walls, and the overhead plane, like a ceiling or a roof. And this can happen on a spectrum from very defined to implied. So for example, if I'm looking at this pergola space here on the left, we have a raised deck, ground plane, square, planks, edging. That's a very defined space just on the ground. The vertical planes are defined by the posts of that pergola, but they're even enhanced by the curtains that have been added. So that although it's not a solid wall, it definitely reads as if like those are clear vertical planes that are defining that space. And then that overhead plane, basically mirrors what's happening on the ground plane and ties into the vertical planes too, with the beams and the fabric that's also part of that, so that you don't have to work very hard to look at that space and basically see the box that is in it. On the lower right though, here is a space that is much more implied than defined. So we're not dealing with rectilinear geometries. We've got a curve that's like a curved retaining wall that's built in. It's basically just kind of like a little nook at the end of this path. We've got this seat wall, this slab of stone that's embedded in that retaining wall. In the background, in the distance, you can see what appears to be a wattle fencing that is starting to imply one possibility for overhead plane. But then we also have this digitalis, the foxglove spikes here that are defining an overhead plane or implying it, sorry. They're suggesting it by their height. And so, looking at this space, I can start to imagine, a non-regular, it's non-orthogonal space where I could come and sit in here and I would feel enclosed, but not in a hard way, a very subtle kind of space definition and enclosure. I also think very deeply about spatial experience. And this is something that's very near and dear to my heart, because what's the point of being human if you're not going to, be as human as you can? I mean, we have these wonderful senses. We have the ability to experience complex sensory inputs like breeze and wind moving through leaves and the sound of that and the rustle and the feel of it on our skin or moving through our hair. This is incredibly rich. And, this is what makes life pleasurable and interesting. So, when I'm designing outdoor spaces, I'm thinking about all the ways that I can basically, tickle all of the humanity of my clients. So I'm thinking about, where am I putting seating? And is that a comfortable place to sit? Do I feel like I want to stop there for a little while? I'm thinking about, am I incorporating texture and smell and sound and sight and taste if I can? And then I'm thinking about those views that people have in whether they're moving along a path or whether they're stopped for a minute and resting and have a chance to contemplate. When I'm designing residential spaces, I also think about how flexible they can be, because life is not the same morning to night, weekday to weekend, summer to winter. It is always different. And so if you're going to be improving a space, it should be able to have that flexibility to accommodate the changes in your life that are just part of life. So, I'm thinking about, will this space work for having your morning coffee outside when the weather is nice? Will it also work if you want to have a dinner party? Does it work if it's you and your friend or your friends hanging out? Or will it also work if your kids and grandkids are coming over and running around? Can you use it during the day, and then can you use it at night? And what are the things that we can do that can make different but wonderful experiences in both? And then will it work summer to fall, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring? What are the different things that are going to happen so that that space is dynamic with the season too? Okay. Funnily enough, but it's not funny. At the very end is when I think about aesthetics. And this is one of the possibly biggest opportunities for disappointment in working with the general public, because for the most part, the general public, when they're thinking about outdoor spaces, they've reduced it to aesthetics because for the most part, that's what you're seeing on HGTV. But aesthetics is the very last thing, because I've had to think about how it's going to handle the traffic, how it's going to handle the different functions, what forms I can use to support the inhabiting of that space. This is the icing on top of the cake. And so, when I'm thinking about landscape styles, I'm having to think about organization, how many axes, or if there are axes in that space, what are the geometries that characterize that style, what materials are used, what kind of plants I might get to use, and then furnishings and decor. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these. So landscape styles are, for the most part, born out of places and cultures and traditions. And I think it's wonderful that, human civilization, human society has all of these different expressions of a space that is desirable to be outside. I love it all. But, most of us don't live in some place that is, able to mimic the whole world. So should you find yourself or working with somebody who really loves a particular landscape style that isn't really natural to this part of the country, you can think about rhyming with it by using native elements, native plants that kind of repeat some of the same characteristics that you might see in that other style. So here, just some photos of some different styles that you may have experienced. So in the top left, a Japanese garden with a stone lantern and the layered plantings that are typical of Japanese gardens. On the right, there's a New Orleanian courtyard, which is primarily hard surfaces, and of course a central water feature, and then some evergreen elements in that shady space. And then the lower left is a Mexican patio, deeply shaded, but overlooking a sunny terrace with some oleander there in the foreground. Okay, so when I'm breaking down aesthetics, if I'm having to think about expressing a style in a particular location, I start out by asking, what is its organization? Is it orthogonal? Is it based on rectilinear forms? Is it radial? Is it based off of a circular form? Is it linear? Is it just pretty much something that's in a line? Or is it curvilinear? Does it have organic, more free-flowing forms? I also am always thinking about axis or axes. Axes is the plural of axis. And usually there's no such thing as a single axis. Almost always in a landscape, if you have an axis, you're going to have a second axis. It could be a parallel axis or it could be a cross axis. And usually there's a hierarchical relationship between them. There's usually a major axis and then a minor axis or minor axes. So just when you're looking at your style, if you see that axis is a really important organizing element, that is something that you'll want to think about replicating. I'm also looking at the fundamental geometries that are characteristic of a style. Is it based on rectangles, squares, or circles? Is it based on an oval or an ellipse? Is it a formal geometry with a very strong center, like a square or a circle? Or is it more informal? Like the different shapes of rectangles have a different importance of that center. Or lastly, is it irregular? Is there not a very clear geometry that's apparent? And there's other things that are defining the shapes of the spaces. One little comment I will share with y'all here. For the most part, the general public is very captivated by formal geometries, circles, squares. But there is a danger. These forms are very powerful, and for good and for bad. So something with a very strong, clear center is a great geometry to use if you really want to emphasize a center, like a central fountain or a place where you would want people to gather and stay for a while. But that strength of that center is also something that can create a space that's dead very quickly, that's static, where it's basically all of the interest is sinking to that center, and then there's no way out of it. It's kind of like a whirlpool. You get sucked into it, and then that's it. So, I just want to share with you that be careful contemplating square and circle geometries, that you're not creating an eddy that is just going to like deaden your space. Here we get to the fun part. Now we're going shopping. So we're thinking about materials and what kind of materials are characteristic of a style. Are you looking at flagstone? Is that stone cut and hewn, or is it have a rough edge? Has it been treated with heat so that it's very smooth? Are you dealing with brick? Is that brick ancient? Is it just antique and repurposed? Is it a very smooth brick? Are we using concrete? And what's the finish of that? Has it been trowel finished or broom finished, or had salt put in it that disappears so that, then it's like pockmarked? What kinds of woods might be characteristic of this style? Is it aged? Is it always kept oiled and bright? Do you get to use metal like Corten steel or aluminum? Would you get to use like a stock tank, like an aluminum stock tank as part of it? Do you get to use glass, whether it's a mulch, like these pebbles shown here in the picture on the top left, or like an orb or something that would be in the landscape? Does the style use found or repurposed objects, or are they typically new? Are you able to use Trex decking, engineered decking? Is artificial turf even part of it? And even like the mulch selection, are you using like a pine straw or a shredded hardwood mulch, or some other form of mulch that is characteristic of that style, even like a gravel? But that combination of materials that you pick, helps that aesthetic, helps that style hang together. And then the plants, which of course I love. This is one of my favorite things to do, but they do really work in concert with everything else. And of course, we're thinking about what are their dimensions? Are they evergreen or not? What's their life history? Do they go dormant? Do they die back? Are they annuals? Do they have a habit? Are they weeping? Are they upright? Are they dense? Are they open? Do they have fine textured leaves or coarse textured leaves? What's their color and how long do they bloom? And are there other things like scent or edibility, or sound that they make when the wind moves through them, or ways that they look when morning or evening sun passes through them? All of these things are contributing to that experience in the aesthetic composition. And then, this is, the part that's often featured on the TV shows, but really is the very end, thinking about acquiring furnishings and decor. And again, you're wanting to just stay in line with that style that you're using. Are you using like a traditional wood outdoor seating, or perhaps is it a rope chair? Are your planters terracotta, or are they painted? Are they metal containers? Or are they even repurposed items? And then for decor, is statuary an element that's part of that aesthetic that you would use as a focus in certain views of your garden? And then are there certain colors or finishes that you would definitely need to incorporate? Like tropical gardens often are characterized by bright, high saturation colors. Whereas a traditional, like a British formal garden, you might see more muted colors like whites for sure, lavenders, purples, light pinks, things like that. So just, putting those finishing touches where it's all hanging together. Oh, dang it, I did it again. I almost got to the end without doing it one more time. Let me get back to where I was. Okay, so this is just like, what I might do. And going back to that client who needed the yard out front to close up that space and work more for them. Full disclosure, a lot of the design work that I do up until like at least the mid to later point of the process, I'm using really sketchy drawings. I'm keeping it loose. I'm not focusing on precision. I'm focusing on starting to build a scene that feels like it's starting to hang together. And this drawing right here, is not the first one. This is, as I'm kind of like working through drawings and revising my ideas. But working in perspective can be really helpful to help you ground, what you're kind of thinking through. And then as you move forward, you can refine it even more, bring it into plan view and start to figure out where those things might be. That said, you don't necessarily ever have to go to plan view, especially if you're dealing with a smaller site. You can certainly, use things like landscape flags or landscape paint, or even if you don't want to put paint on a landscape, you can even take sacks of flour and, pop open a corner and drag it to create lines of where you might want to put elements. You might drag hoses around to start to create lines, but there is nothing wrong with designing an outdoor space and never creating a plan view plan. You can design it completely just on site, like Frederick Law Olmsted did. You can, start to play with things with perspective and figuring out where things might go. I'm not dogmatic about it. I guess I'll just say that, because in the end, what's most important is that you create a space that feels right, that feels fantastic. If you have a pretty drawing, but a space that doesn't work, then that's a failure. But if you have a fantastic space and messy drawings, you did your job right. So with that, I'm going to check the time. Okay, so we're about, I think, 50 minutes in. I think now might be a good time to stop. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Any questions from the audience in present? Nope. No raised hands. Any questions out there on Zoom? I see a lot of comments about the rooster. What about some questions out there on Zoom? I'm not getting any questions right now. I think what I'm hoping is that there's going to be a reveal at the end with that drawing. Do you have? Yeah. I'm hoping.
Sandra has her hand raised.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Sandra.
It was more of a comment than a question. One of the things that I've come to understand in dealing with my own landscape is, especially if you're trying to do something formal, you have to consider maintenance, because there are some things that get really ugly once they're past a certain stage. And some of them are, easy to do. You just go through and deadhead, and some of them require like the really formal stuff, trimming all those boxwood hedges and stuff. And so I'm sure you have clients who want something, a certain thing, and you're going, this is going to be a maintenance nightmare for them. And so how do you convince them to do something different?
Yeah, that I'm so glad you asked that, because honestly, maintenance is just as important in design as all the things that I've talked about. So the big thing that I find does a lot of the work is, in my professional experience, I have bid maintenance contracts. I have been somebody who visits a site and prepares the contract for what it would be to maintain it. And so I have a good working knowledge of what it costs to maintain certain landscape elements. So just being able to break it down and say, are you willing to pay $100 a month for this thing that you want? Because, we could specify a boxwood that you want to keep meatballed, or we can talk about another shrub that might have a mounded habit naturally. And, maybe you're only spending $100 a year maintaining that. Money talks. So that's the first thing. If the money is not getting it, I will then also break down, like, this will take this many hours to be maintained. So if you're going to do this yourself, just so professionals do this, would budget 5 hours a month to do this. Are you prepared to give this 5 hours a month during the growing season? And that's another huge thing. It also really just depends on the client. I will, full disclosure, I would say my job as a landscape designer is probably 70% psychology and 30% my design education. But just being able to read a client and understand, like, what's going to motivate them most. Is it not wanting to spend the money on it? Is it not wanting to spend the time? Is it being mindful of, say, like, gas-powered tools that it takes to maintain something? And not wanting to impact the environment that way. So that's also something that I talk to them about. And I always come at it like, I want to be able to give you the most flexibility to enjoy the landscape unless you want to be maintaining it, that's your joy, great. But I try to talk to my clients about enjoying more of living in the landscape rather than maintaining it. Does that help, Sandra?
Yeah, it's a good question.
So should you find yourself like unclear on like what does it take to maintain stuff? If you have any friends at a wholesale nursery, anybody behind the counter at a wholesale or a large retail nursery would be able to tell you, that iris actually takes a lot more to maintain than you would think. Or, if you do the work yourself, obviously you might know some of that. But, if you're looking for like larger scale information on maintenance, certainly anybody who works at a nursery would have something to say to you about it.
Yeah. That was quite the laugh line, Leslie, on the psychology bit. Everybody, I think we all enjoyed that. There is another question in the chat box. What fundamentals would you suggest one focus on to start learning design?
Okay, now you're getting into dogma, which is dangerous, but I'm in for it. So know yourself. If you are somebody who naturally sees geometries and axes and those kind of dimensional relationships when you're in a space, good. Then I would say, it'd be really important to focus on practicing presence and being really in tune with where am I comfortable? Where am I uncomfortable? Why? What do I like about the degree of enclosure that I'm in? What am I noticing birds singing? Am I noticing how things smell? Like digging into the sensory part of it. If you're somebody who naturally is more in tune with that, all of that sensory stuff, but doesn't have a background in like organization or geometrical relationships or axes, that's also fine. Like it's fine to start there. There are a gazillion design books that, introduce those principles of landscape design that you can get at the library and learn about things like axial relationships, and that language. But I'll tell you what I tell my first year design students. It's all about spatial definition, how you're defining spaces. And it's all about spatial experience. What's that experience in the space? Because you can have a ground plane and 4 walls and an overhead plane, but depending on the relationship between those, the porosity of those planes, and things like, plants or other elements of it that, introduce light or sound or whatever, it can be very different. So it really all comes down to spatial definition and spatial experience. And if you're defining spaces and creating a certain experience, honestly, you're ahead of a lot of people with a shingle hung up out there.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. That's all the questions we have right now. There's a comment, it makes so much sense, spatial and sensory experience. So.
Well, thank you all.
Oh, there is another question here in the room.
The question about water, do you defer to mitigate or concentrate water issues? Because it's going to be more and more in the future that it's either not there at all or it's there in abundance.
So if I could repeat the question for those out there, the question is about water. Do you mitigate it or concentrate the water, given that we are now experiencing either no water or too much water?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So climate change projections for our part of the country are that we are going to experience longer periods of drought, longer periods of not enough rain, but very intense storm events with high volume water when they do happen. Overall, it's going to be more of a drought condition in this part of the country than we have experienced in the past. But because of that, heavy drying that happens before a big rainfall, we have the potential to generate a lot of stormwater runoff, scour, erosion that happens when that rainfall happens. So it's actually both. We need to think about being able to manage higher water flows when they happen. So, if you have a roof that has downspouts and it's not tied into underground drainage, you may want to consider rain barrels or a series of rain barrels or even a cistern if you have that kind of space, or at least certainly being able to convey water coming out of your downspouts to a place where it's not going to scour or damage your landscape or, get into your basement or whatever. We also are going to have to think about switching or incorporating more plants that can tolerate heavy moisture soil conditions, for a period of time, but then drought in between. So luckily, a lot of our natives for this part of the country are actually really well suited for that. But just paying attention to encouraging clients to say no to really particular plants. So for example, like azaleas in the summertime here, if anybody's got an azalea, I think the time period for successful azaleas is short. They are going to really suffer in the summer. All of the plants that really are, zone 5 and not zone 6, we're going to have to say goodbye to those too. The predictions are basically that at least by 2100, that our climate will be more like the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area than it is now. So, just thinking about plants that can really tolerate that heat. But back to the water, capturing high volumes of water, and then thinking about plantings that can tolerate periods of drought is the name of the game.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, but I have put the YouTube channel up there because inevitably there's always questions about recording, and some kudos on the chat, certainly. So I'll let you go ahead and finish up, Leslie.
Okay, I'm sorry to disappoint y'all. I don't have a big reveal on that front garden. It's actually in process right now. But maybe I will share with y'all a photo of when it's done. But that's all I have. I would just say, thanks, and yay for helping people design spaces that work for their lives and add to their lives. It's a really great gift to give people.
Well, thank you very much, Leslie. People will look this. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And from somebody who is very design challenged, I appreciate that. I think most of us have the experience where, we just all go to the store and we buy plants and then we look for places to put them. It's sort of more our design feature. So that's kind of what we do. So it's good. This is a good, thoughtful thing to think about. So we all really appreciate that very much. Have a good weekend and thanks for being with us, everybody. And this will be up on the YouTube channel next week as we think about design. Okay, so thank you again, Leslie.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.